There's a feeling a home carries when something is deeply wrong. It isn't a sound you can name or a chill you can trace to an open window. It's more like a pause that settles into the walls, a heaviness that doesn't belong. I first noticed it the evening my husband, Walter, returned from his doctor's appointment and said absolutely nothing about what had been discussed. He placed his keys on the counter the way he always did, filled a glass with water, and stood at the kitchen window staring out at the garden we had tended together for over 3 decades. I asked how the appointment had gone. He told me it was fine. Walter had never been the kind of man who filled rooms with words, but that night, fine was the one word that told me everything without telling me anything at all. Something in my chest already understood. We built what we had with our own hands. That isn't a figure of speech. Walter launched his trucking business from a single car garage in 1987, starting with a used flatbed truck and a verbal agreement with a lumber supplier from a neighboring county. I managed the finances on yellow legal pads for the first 3 years. By the time our son Denton reached middle school, we were operating 14 trucks. By his high school graduation, that number had grown to 41. We were never people who chased attention or lived beyond our means. We stayed in the same house we'd purchased when we married, expanding it in phases as life required. We drove practical cars, put Denton through a good university, and paid for it outright. Everything we owned, we earned. I say that because it's essential to everything that follows. 3 weeks after that silent night at the window, Walter asked me to sit with him at the dining room table. That same table where we'd signed mortgage documents, blown out birthday candles, and worked through every significant disagreement of our married life. He told me the truth. Stage 4, pancreatic. The doctors had given him an estimate, and Walter had spent 3 weeks turning it over privately before he could bring himself to say it to me. I didn't cry immediately. I held his hand and I listened. That was the foundation of who we were together. Even when the words were the kind that permanently shift something inside you, we chose to listen before everything else. But then he said something I wasn't prepared for. He told me he needed me to do something before the end of the month, before anyone outside our home found out. He asked me to remove my name from all our shared accounts and open 2 new ones solely in my name, then move everything into them. I didn't understand, and I told him so. He was quiet for a moment before explaining. Denton's wife had been contacting the company's attorney, asking questions she had no legitimate reason to be asking. Her name was Suki. Denton had married her 6 years earlier in a ceremony we had funded, at a venue she selected, with a guest list she determined. I had smiled through every moment of it because she was the woman my son had chosen, and I wanted deeply to believe she loved him. I had tried for 6 years to believe that. I asked Walter what kind of questions she had been asking. He looked at me with a weariness that didn't come from a single restless night, but from a long accumulation of quiet worry. Someone had told her he was ill, he said. She was already trying to map out what would happen to the business when he was gone. I sat with that for a long time before saying that she wasn't entitled to anything. He agreed, but she would try anyway, he said, and Denton would allow it. That was the part that cut the deepest. Not Suki's intentions. We both understood who she was. What broke something open was hearing Walter say plainly what we had both been unwilling to name for years, that our son had gradually become a man who followed his wife into territory he never would have entered on his own. I opened the new accounts the following Tuesday. Everything was transferred by Thursday. Walter sat at the kitchen table in his reading glasses and watched me do it, checking each confirmation number against a handwritten list. When the last transfer was confirmed, he folded the list, sealed it in an envelope, and wrote my name across the front. He told me not to open it until I needed to. I placed it in the back pocket of my winter coat where I kept things I needed to hold on to but couldn't bring myself to look at. Walter died on a Sunday morning in March, 59 days after he told me he was sick. He went the way he had lived, quietly and without ceremony. I was holding his hand. The room carried the scent of lavender soap I had brought from home because he couldn't tolerate the smell of hospitals. He was 64 years old. I drove home alone because I had asked everyone to give me that morning to myself. I sat in the driveway for a long while before I could make myself go inside. The house was just a structure then, filled with 31 years of accumulated living and completely, wholly silent. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in his chair near the window and watched the sky darken and then slowly come back to light. Denton called the next morning, He said he was sorry. He said he loved me. He mentioned he'd come by Wednesday to go through a few things together. I said that was fine. I told myself the phrasing meant nothing, that sorting through practical matters after a loss was simply what families did. Wednesday arrived. Denton showed up at 11. Suki was with him, which I'd anticipated, but there was also a third person, a man I didn't recognize, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a suit that was just a little too polished for a home visit. I stood at the door and looked at my son. He couldn't quite hold my gaze. He told me the man's name was Mr. Ferris and that he was an attorney. I stepped aside and let them in because what else does a mother do when her son appears at the door 2 days after his father's burial? You let him in, you make coffee, you sit across the table from the person you raised, and you search for him somewhere in that familiar face. Mr. Ferris opened his portfolio on my dining room table with the ease of someone who considered the room already his. He said he was present on behalf of certain interested parties concerning the estate of my late husband. I raised my hand to stop him. I reminded him that my husband had been gone for 48 hours. He said he understood this was a painful time. I asked whether he truly did, given that I hadn't yet selected the flowers for Walter's memorial service. Suki reached across and touched Denton's arm in that precise way she had, the gesture that functioned simultaneously as a signal and a directive. Denton sat up straighter. He told me they only needed to understand the situation with the company and what the transition forward would look like, that his father would have wanted everything to be transparent. I looked at my son for a long, steady moment. Walter had worked himself into the ground and then beyond it, constructing something lasting for this family. Denton had grown up watching that happen, had even spent 2 summers in the dispatch office before concluding it wasn't the path for him. That had been perfectly acceptable. We never pressured him. He'd pursued real estate and built a reasonable life. We were proud of him. But somewhere during the last 6 years, a reasonable life had begun to look smaller when measured against what Walter had built. And I believe that's when the calculation shifted, first in Suki's mind and then gradually in Denton's. I told them his father had a plan and they would learn about it when the appropriate time came. Suki said they'd prefer to hear about it now. She had a particular manner of speaking, measured and controlled, every sentence sounding pre-considered. I had always found it unsettling. In that moment, I found it something considerably more than that. I stood up and asked all three of them to leave. Mr. Ferris looked uncomfortable. Denton looked at Suki. Suki looked at me. I reminded my son that he had brought a lawyer into my home 2 days after his father's death, without a phone call, without any warning, and had allowed a stranger to open a portfolio on the same table where we had made every major decision of our family's life together. My voice stayed even throughout. I had learned over many years that the steadier you keep your voice, the more deeply what you say is felt. Then I told all three of them to get out of my house. They left. I stood in the kitchen until I heard their car back out of the driveway and disappear. Then I walked to my coat closet, reached into the pocket of my winter coat, and took out Walter's envelope. I sat down and opened it. His handwriting, small and careful, exactly as it had always been. The letter explained everything, not just the account transfers, which he had already walked me through in person, but all of it. The corporate structure, which he had quietly reorganized 18 months prior with a separate attorney, one Suki had never encountered. The full ownership stake, now held solely in my name, structured as a completed transfer executed before his death, entirely documented and entirely legal, and a minority share of 20% set aside in a trust for Denton, accessible when he reached 55 with no provision for transfer to a spouse. At the bottom, written in different ink as though added on a separate occasion, were these words: "I'm sorry I didn't say this sooner. I saw it coming for a long time. I just didn't want it to be true." I folded the letter and held it for a while. Then I called Elaine, our family's actual attorney, a woman who had known us for 20 years, and I told her everything. What followed was neither swift nor simple, but it was thorough. Mr. Ferris, it emerged, had been retained by Suki personally, not by Denton, not jointly, but by Suki alone, charged to a credit card in her name. He had been retained 6 weeks before Walter's death. 6 weeks, which meant she had known, or had known enough to begin preparing, well before our family had any official word of his condition. When Elaine uncovered this through billing records that Mr. Ferris had been careless about protecting, it opened an entirely different line of inquiry. How had Suki learned of Walter's illness before even our family had been told? The answer surfaced from a direction no one had thought to look. There was a woman who had worked as an administrative assistant at Walter's physician's office for 11 years. Her name, and this is the detail that still makes me close my eyes, was someone Denton had briefly dated during his college years, long before he ever met Suki. A connection so old and so faint that it hadn't occurred to anyone to consider it. Suki had identified her, had cultivated that connection quietly over the years. When Walter's diagnosis was entered into the system, that woman placed a phone call she had no right to make. She lost her position. She faced a review by the relevant licensing authority. She no longer works in healthcare. Suki was formally served with papers related to the unauthorized disclosure of protected medical information. Civil proceedings followed. A settlement was eventually reached, one I am bound by agreement not to describe in specific terms, but which, I will say, was substantial enough that Suki could not simply absorb it and move forward. As for Denton, he sat across from me in Elaine's office on a Tuesday afternoon in May, 7 weeks after his father's funeral, and for the first time since everything began, Suki was not present. She had her own legal representation by then. Their interests, as Elaine had formally established, were no longer shared. He looked as though he hadn't slept properly in weeks. He looked in an almost unbearable way like his father. The worn version. The version Walter had when something had been pressing on him that he hadn't yet found a way to put into words. I didn't speak first. I waited. He told me he hadn't known about the doctor's office. I believed him. That was the difficult part of it. I genuinely believed him. But I told him he had known about Mr. Ferris. He said nothing, which was answer enough. I told him he had known what she was doing and had permitted it. He had let her bring that man into my home 2 days after his father's death and had sat quietly while she spoke on their behalf. He covered his face with his hands. I had rehearsed what I would say in this moment. I had played it out at 3 in the morning when grief and anger alternated their hold on me without allowing any rest in between. I'd crafted the words carefully, but sitting there with my son in front of me, I found I had no desire to deliver them. What I felt beneath the anger was something closer to sorrow, a second layer of grief beneath the first, the grief that comes from watching someone you love diminish from who they once were. The grief of understanding that you can give a child everything you possess and still lose them to the accumulation of small, wrong choices. I told him that his father had loved him, that he had preserved a share of everything he had built for him, that he had made certain Denton would be cared for, and that Denton had still sat in that room. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said he knew. The company is mine now. I run it alongside a management team Walter had spent his final months quietly assembling, making certain I wouldn't have to navigate it alone. We operate 63 trucks. I go into the office 3 days each week. I know the name of every driver on our roster. Denton and Suki finalized their divorce 8 months after Walter's death. Denton called me the evening it was done, and we talked for a long time. We are not fully restored to what we were before all of this. I'm not certain we ever will be completely. But we speak now, and we speak honestly. Given where things stood in those darkest weeks, that is more than I had allowed myself to hope for. I still have my winter coat. The pocket is empty now, but I've kept the coat. There's something I understood through all of this that I hadn't anticipated learning. It isn't about money, though money was what they came for. It isn't even solely about greed, though greed was unmistakably present. It's about this. The people who genuinely love you make preparations on your behalf even when they are exhausted, even when they are frightened, even when preparation means sitting at a kitchen table with reading glasses on, checking handwritten account numbers against a list, making certain that when they are no longer there, you will have solid ground beneath you. Walter understood what was approaching. He could not alter the outcome, but he could ensure that everything he had built, everything we had built side by side, arrived somewhere safe. It arrived here, with me, and I intend to honor it. I've spent considerable time reflecting on what happened, not only the legal dimensions, the paperwork and the proceedings and the settlement, but the larger question beneath all of it. How does a family arrive in a room like that one? How does a son sit across from his grieving mother with an attorney's portfolio on the table and convince himself that this is an acceptable thing to do? I don't believe Denton came into the world that way. I raised him. I know who he was before. What I've come to understand is that we make choices, small ones, repeatedly, and each one either adds something to our character or quietly removes something from it. Denton made a series of small choices to look away, to stay silent when he should have spoken, to surrender the wheel. And those choices accumulated over time into the person who appeared at my door 2 days after his father's burial. That is not fate. That is not consequence delivered from somewhere above. That is simply the mechanism. You act, and the acting shapes you, and eventually you become what your choices have been quietly building all along. Walter understood this. That is what I returned to again and again. In those final months, sick and depleted and carrying fears he never voiced out loud, he still chose the harder path every single time. He could have dismissed what he suspected about Suki. He could have told himself it probably wouldn't amount to anything serious, that Denton would never truly let things go that far. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table in his reading glasses and did the necessary work. He protected me not from suspicion or resentment, but from a love that was also wise. That combination is far less common than most people recognize. I've thought often about what it means to possess genuine clarity, not academic intelligence, not worldly success, measured in the ways the world typically measures it, but actual clear-sightedness. Walter had it. He could perceive people as they actually were without requiring them to be otherwise in order to go on loving them. He saw what Suki was. He saw what Denton had permitted himself to become. And he loved his son completely regardless. You can see that love in how he structured the trust, making sure Denton couldn't be excluded entirely, making sure something would be waiting for him at 55 if he found his way back to himself. That kind of intelligence is not cold. It is precisely the opposite. It requires real courage to look honestly at something painful and respond with care rather than bitterness. As for myself, I won't pretend the past year has been anything other than what it was. There are mornings when I still reach across the bed before the memory returns. There are afternoons when the sight of his empty chair produces grief as sharp as it was in the first week. That doesn't resolve. I don't think it's meant to, but I am still standing. The company is still operating. 63 drivers report for work each morning because Walter constructed something genuine and I have kept it genuine. There is a form of strength that remains invisible to you until the moment you have no alternative but to discover it. I found it. I am still finding it. Denton called last week. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, a new restaurant he had visited, a memory of his father from his childhood. It was a small conversation, but it was an honest one. Right now, honest is sufficient.